Have you ever seen a frontman with an inverted cross branded into his forehead? Roadrunner Records paid to have his tonsils removed so he could go on tour. The band would receive death threats after their singer shot a squirrel during an interview. And he would even admit to believing in demonic possession and thought his lyrics would grant him entrance to hell itself. One of the biggest selling death metal groups of all time, and still going strong, having released 13 studio albums during their career, with the latest being Banished by Sin. This is Holy Deception, the story of the one and only Deicide.
Oblivious!
Death metal is arguably the most extreme form of heavy metal music. With its origins rooted deep within Tampa, Florida, this small scene grew to become a globally recognized behemoth of a genre. And whilst groups such as Death, Morbid Angel, Possessed, and Cannibal Corpse would all come to be seen as the leaders of the sound, Deicide had a slightly different edge to everyone else. And no, I'm not saying all of those bands came from Tampa. Originally called Carnage, Deicide weren't just extreme on record, they were extreme in almost every aspect of what they did. Early influences such as Venom were toying around with the image of Satanism, whilst Deicide vocalist Glenn Benton was more interested in quite literally making his face a canvas for blasphemy. As with most metal bands that formed in the 80s, many of them did so for a few very similar reasons, usually anger and rebellion. Much of that rebellion came from being raised in either a strict household or a religious one.
Standing here on bass, and they're going to do a couple original tunes.
This was no different for Glenn Benton, an original member of Deicide. When I was 8 years old and forced against my will to participate in the Christmas play at the church my mother was a Sunday school teacher at, I was singing at the front of the church thinking, how did I get myself into this? My father's side of the family were Catholic and my mother's Lutheran, so I got the worst of both worlds. And if you're wondering why I'm pronouncing Deicide like Deicide and not Deicide, well, that's because in the 90s, you know, when the internet didn't exist, we British people would find out about bands from things like Headbangers Ball or the radio, and this is just how it was pronounced.
Extreme metal news, Deicide have just released their third album.
Deicide is also of Latin origin and would be pronounced Deicide in Latin. However, Americans will say Deicide, but you can all argue with me in the comment section about the right way to pronounce it.
Did I get that right?
Got it.
Good.
Despite Glenn growing up listening to Elvis and Little Richard as a kid, he would quickly discover the path to heavy metal via his hatred for religion. Well, that and probably the fact he saw Black Sabbath when he was apparently 8 years old. It would appear that he took his rebellion to the extreme though. The first Deicide record would be released in 1990, and it would be roughly this same time period that Glenn decided to do something extremely drastic. I think I was only 22 when I burned the inverted cross into my forehead. The spirit moved me, man. To this day, I don't know what I was thinking, but I knew that I had been christened Catholic as a child, and I felt that the best way to take care of that would be my symbolic way of taking that Catholic mark off of my skin. I've always been that kid in the picture who's got that twisted look and the smile on his face. And when I got to an age where I could start being me, I just started being me.
But we have a group here by the name of Amen.
Deicide, as the now classic or original lineup is known, would officially form on July the 21st, 1987. Glenn Benton, Steve Assame, and brothers Eric and Brian Hoffman. This would be the lineup from 1987 until their seventh studio record, Scars of the Crucifix, released in 2004. And I think it's fair to say that over the years, Glenn Benton became quite literally the face of the band.
It's up to the individual. If you want to listen to this music, that's fine. If you don't buy it.
With not a lot of death metal really at his fingertips for inspiration, he essentially had to carve out his own path as a death metal singer. And from the beginning, he was out to be the best. When I was getting to be a later teenager and stuff like that, seeing all the bands playing, for me, it was like Savatage back then. They were a local band playing the bars and the club scene. We had Nasty Savage and those bands like that. For me, it was to outdo my competitors as far as bringing on or trying to be the most extreme you possibly could. The vocal thing kind of came naturally for me. There was no particular thing for me to follow back then, so I just pretty much did what I did, and not everybody was accepting of my vocals. I like the music, I hate the vocals. I heard that a lot in the beginning. Nasty Savage is most likely a group many people would have heard of when delving into the influences of extreme music, at least from this area of the US. Chuck Schuldiner of Death was even a big fan of these guys. They released their debut studio album in 1985, and Glenn Benton almost joined Nasty Savage. Nasty Savage, though, were for sure more thrash-orientated, and the vocal style was absolutely not aligned with what Glenn had in mind. What Nasty Savage's singer did on stage, though, did catch Glenn's attention. Ronnie Galletti used to have all these TV sets on stage that he'd smash, and I remember putting my fist through some of them. Talk about a show. The guy used to roll around in the glass from the TVs, and one night I saw his old lady pulling broken glass out of his back after the gig, and I thought, holy shit, this is the real deal. Savatage, on the other hand, probably wasn't much of a risk when it came to competition for Deicide. They released 4 studio LPs in the 80s, with the first being Sirens in 1983. All of these records could be described as, at the most, heavy metal. Nothing really extreme going on here from a musical standpoint. But still an interesting reference point for the story of Deicide, as this is what was happening at the time. The first demos Deicide released would be recorded in 1987 and 1989, when the group was still called Amon.
There is a local radio show called The Pit that caters exclusively to the metal fan.
They also managed to get some exposure on what looks like a local TV station when they were still going by this name.
Okay, that's all right. Thank you. If you're wondering what these fellas are doing behind me, I don't know either.
And as I'm sure we all know by now, there wasn't a lot of death metal flying around this time period. We had Seven Churches by Possessed in 1985 and Scream Bloody Gore by Death in 1987. So these two groups, along with Venom, were big influences in the early sound of Deicide. Back then, you had a lot of stuff coming out on Metal Blade. For us, we had Venom and Possessed. Death came out of that, and a lot of those bands. Those were what we were listening to back then, and I used to work for Camelot Music. All the promotional metal that came in, they didn't play it, so all that stuff went right to my house. That's how I learned about a lot of different bands back then. Benton would discover Possessed in his own very unique way, of course. I was tripping balls one night and I listened to Seven Churches, Possessed, and for me, I was like, yeah, it all made sense. I listened to Slayer and all that stuff like everybody else, but I also grew up listening to classic rock and roll, so when I started getting into the heavier stuff, the more angrier it was, the more I liked it. So when I heard Venom, I was like, well, this is ugly, but I can't stop listening to it. Slayer and Venom, of course, were a big influence on almost every extreme band to ever exist. Venom released their debut Welcome to Hell in 1981, and Slayer dropped Show No Mercy in 1983. And whilst they both played on the image of being satanic, both groups did this more for theatrics and shock marketing, as opposed to really wanting to hang out with Satan. Glenn Benton, though, seemed quite literally hell-bent on channeling Satanism through his lyrics and music. And this was quite literally solidified in a 1991 interview with Benton himself.
To create the most evilest music and to gain entrance into the seven gates of hell.
He even stated that he believed in demonic possession and was himself possessed.
So a concert is an act of worship for you?
Not exactly. It's a focal point to express my Satanism.
Do you believe in demonic possession?
Of course.
Are you possessed?
Of course.
This interview took place just 1 year after the release of Deicide's debut record. Deicide's first full-length studio album would be recorded at Morrisound in Florida and produced by Scott Burns. Morrisound would become an iconic studio for the death metal genre. Death recorded several albums here, along with Cannibal Corpse and Morbid Angel, amongst many others. Even Sepultura's 1991 LP Arise would be recorded at this studio.
Sadness, sorrow, everything sore. Finding life, alter state.
And Scott Burns himself became a prominent name within death metal, having worked on records for Death, Sepultura, Cannibal Corpse, and lots more. So Deicide were in the perfect environment for their first album. Officially labeled as a death metal record, Deicide's debut would offer a brutally raw sound mixed with religious blasphemy, which could not be clearer when reading song titles such as Lunatic of God's Creation, Oblivious to Evil, and Crucifixation. Not only did they sound like they were going to war with God himself, they even looked like they were ready for a holy battle on stage. And if I'm completely honest, they kind of made Slayer look about as dangerous as Nickelback. Sorry, Slayer. You did also have King Diamond that openly stated he was a Satanist and certainly tried to look a very specific way on stage. I guess like a Satanist might look.
It's like, I'm not into the face painting thing. I think it looks cartoonish and it cheapens it. Okay.
Benton, however, definitely didn't see King Diamond as someone that truly opposed Christianity or even practiced Satanism. When it comes down to the hardcore facts, put me and King Diamond in a bed and there is going to come out one person. That one person would be me, and not King Diamond. I am not in this for the theatrics. I'm not doing this for monetary gains. I'm doing this because of something that I have been sent here to do. King Diamond does this so he can wipe some white shit over his face and pretend that he's a Satanist. He has already openly admitted that he is not an advocate for Satan. And I would think that seeing Deicide live at this time, looking the way they did and sounding the way they did, would have been a hell of an experience. And speaking of hell, the lyrics throughout Deicide's debut record weren't exactly written with the hope of getting a Billboard #1. Damned to hell, end my life. Wrath of God, Satan. Sin my soul, blessed with fire. Throne of Stone, Satan. That was taken from the second track called Sacrificial Suicide, and honestly, these lyrics are tame compared to some of Deicide's other offerings. For I am the Deicide, Dominus, what could you do? Thou has failed you now, once again and always will. On the cross, forgotten son, a sacrifice, it had to be done. These lyrics were taken from the song called Deicide, but what is a deicide exactly? Well, the word deicide comes from the medieval Latin word deicidium, as I would pronounce it now. In Latin, this would have been roughly pronounced as deicidium back in the day, which basically means the killing of God. This band is literally called The Killing of God. So if the image wasn't clear and the lyrics weren't clear, the band name sure as hell should be clear regarding their take on religion. So does this mean that Deicide is actually one of the few genuine satanic metal bands in existence? It's not an image, it's what I am. Do I look like a Christian to you? Well, trust me, I'm not a Christian, and I believe in Lucifer. I am what I am. I practice it, I live it. That's who I am. I have a spiritual link with my master that runs my life, tells me what to say, and tells me what to write about. All right? So from Glenn Benton's perspective, he was very much a Satanist. He lived it, breathed it, and was using his band to spread his blasphemous satanic message to the world. His bandmates didn't exactly share his enthusiasm though. When asked about his views, Deicide drummer Steve Assame quickly denounced any such beliefs regarding any religion. I support Deicide and their stance. I mean, it's all music and it's all entertainment. I don't have a problem with the message, but I don't hate religion. Although I think it's pretty stupid to follow a particular religion. I think it's a waste of time and life is too short. I just can't afford to waste time praying for anything. Regardless of the message on offer throughout Deicide's debut record released in 1990, this album would help to put them on the path to becoming one of the biggest selling death metal groups of all time. And their next offering would solidify their name in the history books of extreme music.
My views of this world, my views of religion, my hatred to God.
1992 would be a very interesting year for Deicide. Not only would they release their second studio record, Legion, but they would also nearly get blown to pieces, quite literally. Glenn was being interviewed by Enemy magazine as part of the new press cycle for the new album. Benton, though, had been having some issues with squirrels. Yes, squirrels, the cute furry little things that just want your nuts. They had apparently been running riot in his attic and destroying his air conditioning system. And whilst he did his best to safely remove them, not all of them would experience his compassionate side. So he thought shooting it was the best option, and this did not go down well with animal activists, or anyone really. I shot a squirrel during an interview one time. Then they put that in the interview and it was all over. I was having a problem with squirrel infestation in my attic. And there was one squirrel left, and I could never get his ass. And one day when I was sitting in the backyard doing an interview, it came out of the house, out of the attic, and came running across the clothesline in the backyard. They were chewing the foam installation off my Freon line for my air conditioners. So all my pipes were sweating up in the attic and leaving stains on the ceilings. So I got up there, got the nest down, let the babies mature, and let the things get out of the house. And then I blocked the hole. But there was one squirrel in there, and I couldn't get his ass out. This led to the band receiving death threats, and someone even tried to blow them up at a show. The show took place in Stockholm, Sweden, and at first everyone thought that it was Norwegian black metal kids, as they didn't really like the whole death metal thing that was going on at the time. Then the finger turned to animal activists. And as an animal activist myself and a vegan of 20 years, this is why people hate vegans. Seriously, a squirrel gets shot and you try to blow people up. Idiots. I think it was animal activists or something. It wasn't really much of a bomb. I do more damage in the morning to my toilet. All it did was knock the door off its hinges, and they make it sound like someone detonated a small nuclear device or a dirty bomb or something. It was maybe a quarter stick of dynamite. That kind of charge, more like an M80 or something. Maybe a couple of M80s placed in a bucket by the door, but it wasn't that big a deal. That was more hype. It was Roadrunner trying to hype it up. Their office did get firebombed back in the day though. Of course, this record label tried to milk this as much as possible. We all know how famous black metal became in the 90s because of all the press the scene received due to church burnings and murder. Even Kerrang covered the story in the UK edition of the magazine. The incident naturally made front page headlines in Sweden. The police decided it would be better for the band to play the show though, in fear of a riot starting, which I find very Swedish. Although animal activists were blamed, nobody ever claimed responsibility for the incident, and nobody was ever charged with a crime, so we don't actually know for sure who it was. The real victim here, though, wasn't Deicide. This essentially brought the entire Swedish death metal scene to a standstill. Jörgen Sigfridsson, then owner of a small death metal record label in Sweden at the time, said the following: "That night was the end of the original death metal scene in Sweden. After that, there were hardly any shows for a long time, and it all just faded. The great feeling that had been present at that Candlemass gig in 1987 was long gone. I got out of that scene shortly after that. It was all over." This incident in Stockholm took place in November of 1992, and the second Deicide record, Legion, was released a few months earlier in June of the same year. So this was essentially great and free publicity for the band. And I would have to say that out of every death metal record released from this era, Legion has to be one of the most brutally evil sounding death metal records to hit the shelves. Lyrically, it followed the same anti-religious themes as their debut, but musically, it just feels evil. Like it's almost painful to the soul to even listen to. Legion, along with Deicide's debut, would become two of the biggest selling death metal records of this era. As of November 2003, Deicide's first record had sold over 110,000 copies, and Legion had shifted over 103,000 copies, only being beaten by Morbid Angel's third studio record, Covenant, which saw sales of over 127,000 since its release in 1993. And a very random fact about the early 90s era of Deicide is that after the Legion album cycle, Glenn had his tonsils removed, which he claimed altered the actual tone of his vocals permanently. He even says this can be heard on every Deicide record after Legion. "It all changed for me when I had my tonsils removed. I was 24 years old, I had a really bad problem. My tonsils were actually just rotting in my throat, so I had them removed courtesy of Roadrunner Records. They paid for it to have the procedure done. 2.5 weeks later, I went to Europe for a tour. I wasn't even healed yet, and I did just nothing but destroy my throat. And that's why I sound the way I do today. That's how I got so low. It was bad enough though, but that's how I got my voice. That was all right after Legion." Between 1992 and 1995 would be two of their longest touring schedules of the 90s, traveling across the United States and also Europe. They even went back to Sweden. Brave. 1995 would also see the release of their third studio record, Once Upon the Cross. And I think by this time, death metal had kind of reached its peak. Unlike heavy metal in general, death metal was always going to have a much smaller appeal, simply because of how brutal the music is to listen to. And also, if we look at the SoundScan figures from 2004, we had Legion released in 1992, selling 103,000 copies. Once Upon a Cross, released in 95, selling just 86,000 copies. And Serpents of the Light, the fourth studio album by Deicide, released in 1997, selling just 53,000 copies. And we can't blame this decline in album sales on YouTube or Spotify streaming services for this time. Even if we look at the band Death and their sales figures for the same period, it's a similar story. As of 2002, Death's 1991 record Human had sold around 74,000 copies. Then Individual Thought Patterns racked up 66,000 copies, and then a huge drop in sales with their 1995 record Symbolic, only shifting around 33,000 copies. And of course, by the mid-90s, extreme music had kind of been given a really bad name. We all know the story of Mayhem. This pretty much killed extreme music's popularity, along with the upcoming rise of nu metal. Korn's debut record landed in 1994 and debuted in the Billboard 200 chart on the 26th of August, 1995. So there was a clear shift in overall interest when it came to metal music. I think the original shock value of death metal during the late 80s captured everyone's attention, but the novelty wore off pretty quickly. And of course, with Metallica selling millions of copies of the Black Album in the early 90s, clearly demonstrated where people's taste in metal music had landed. The majority of hard rock and metal fans still wanted melody and essentially catchy songs. The legacy of Deicide, however, was already set in stone. This documentary is sponsored by me. Go and buy a t-shirt. Links below. Or if you really want to help out my channel, you can become a member. Click the button join below. It's a monthly subscription and you're basically supporting me from a financial perspective. You can cancel it at any time, but you do get a fancy little icon next to your name when you leave a comment. Back to the good stuff. From their inception in 1987 up until their 7th studio record, Scars of the Crucifix, released in 2004, Deicide would have a long-standing and consistent lineup. Glenn Benton, Steve Assame, and the Hoffman brothers, Eric and Brian, would come to be known as the classic lineup. They would release 7 studio albums in total together. However, like almost every metal band ever, internal conflict and arguments over things such as royalties would ultimately be the end of this era of Deicide. The Hoffman brothers would leave in 2005 after receiving their royalty checks for Scars of the Crucifix, and it was not an amicable breakup by any means. As always, both sides had a different story to tell, and just so I don't face a lawsuit here, I will explicitly state that the following information is not my opinion. This is a direct quote from Glenn Benton himself. Eric Hoffman has a steroid problem, and he's bipolar. Brian married some young broad who's running his life for him. What initially happened is that when our publishing deal ended with Roadrunner and our new deal started with Earache, we put them on notice that our publishing was no longer going to be split 4 ways. It's going to be based on who writes what. That's the industry standard. Brian writes 1 song for the album, Eric writes 2 songs, and they want to get paid for all the songs Steve wrote. That's not fair. And they didn't just quit. Allegedly, one of the Hoffman brothers started to make physical threats of violence towards drummer Steve Assame. When they got their first publishing checks and didn't get paid for all the songs me and Steve wrote, they quit. And now we've got to deal with Eric threatening Steve, driving to his house and screaming outside his window at 10:30 at night, making threatening phone calls, talking shit on Blabbermouth about Steve's dad dying, and all this other BS. Eric knows better than to come over here though. He knows I shoot first and ask questions later. Yeah, you don't want to end up like that poor old squirrel. Hey Eric, I'd stay out of Glenn's attic if I were you. Apparently the Hoffman brothers then tried to take legal action against Benton for the rights and trademarks to the Deicide name. They can't do a goddamn thing to me. I own the name. They went behind my back and filed on my trademark, so I'm in the process of suing them to get their names off it. And I'll win. They abandoned their jobs and now they want to come back. Well, there's no coming back. Sorry. It's a better band now because they're gone. They're just a couple of losers, and they rode on me and Steve's coattails for all these years. That's why the deal we signed with Roadrunner in 1990 was set up like that. Back then, everybody wrote and contributed, and it was a group effort. But now, me and Steve are the Lennon and McCartney of the band, doing all the writing. And those two want to get paid for our hard work? One of the replacements for the Hoffman brothers would be Jack Owen, formerly of Cannibal Corpse, who featured on every Cannibal Corpse record from Eaten Back to Life in 1990, my personal favourite, up until The Wretched Spawn, released in 2004. Owen, though, would leave after the 11th Deicide studio record, In the Minds of Evil, released in 2013. Deicide have released a total of 13 studio albums throughout their career, with their debut in 1990 and Legion in 1992, helping to essentially brand their name into the extreme heavy metal history books as absolute legends of the genre. and they are showing absolutely no signs of slowing down whatsoever. Their latest album, Banished by Sin, released in 2024, and even Overtures of Blasphemy, released in 2018, could easily stand up against any modern metal record and beat the crap out of it, hands down. I've seen every messed up thing a person could possibly see. I've been through just about every form of heartbreak a person could feel. I've been through just about every emotional thing that a person can go through, and I can honestly say, the older you get, the more spiteful and bitter you become. I'm not mellowing in what I do. The older I get, the more I want to just shove it up everybody's ass. And honestly, apart from the debut and Legion, these are actually two of my favorite Deicide records. I do feel that death metal in recent years has maybe experienced a slight resurgence in popularity, from younger generations only just discovering the classic death metal records like Seven Churches, Scream Bloody Gore, and Eaten Back to Life, to veterans of the genre rediscovering their love for these records. And I think we're at a cross point in metal where pretty much everyone has gotten incredibly bored of the extremely generic modern metalcore sound that's been around for a few years now, and we want the anger back in our metal. Well, with Deicide, there's no holy deception here, just straight up death metal. Go subscribe to my new gaming channel. Go on, links are on screen and below. Click it, all support appreciated.